For this part of the lecture, we'll be talking about a few of the places the original core ethical principles really came from. So probably the three most commonly talked about sets of guidelines are the Nuremberg Code, the Declaration of Helsinki, and then the Belmont Report. So starting with the Nuremberg Code, this is not technically an official set of guidelines, as it's not actually signed into law by any nation, but then again, many of the nations or research institutions in different nations across the world tend to at least use it as a loose guideline, and then of course there are more official ones that we'll talk about in just a moment. This was created after World War II and the trials of many of the remaining high-ranking Nazi officials. It is specifically based on the first of these trials, which is oftentimes talked about as the Doctors' Trial, and this is where many of the doctors who were involved in especially some of the concentration camps where they did experiments of all manner of things, really testing pain tolerances, to amputating parts of organs, to seeing if twins would suffer psychological distress after one of them was harmed while the other was not. I mean, some of it is pretty horrific, actually. Of course, the reason why this is, I guess, doubly bad, let's say, for the doctor specifically is because doctors generally take the Hippocratic Oath, whereby they swear not to do harm to people. And of course, doing studies where you're directly harming people is a pretty serious violation of that. And that's where the original Nuremberg Code comes from and contains 10 points within it talking about guidelines for doing ethical research. Following this, maybe 10, 15 years later, is the Declaration of Helsinki. The first version was signed then in Helsinki in Finland. I believe the most recent version is the 8th that was just signed into accord in 2008, and the Helsinki Declaration continues to get updated as we move further and further into the future and as various new situations arise or need to be rediscussed. And the Helsinki Declaration is largely focused on medical practice and research, but if you would like to look at it, I have included a copy of it in your iLearn page. The one that's most pertinent to us here and to psychological research, specifically in the United States, is the Belmont Report. And the Belmont Report was put together here after the conclusion of the Tuskegee syphilis study, and it guides both biomedical and psychological research practices. It contains 3 main points that we will talk about now. So the first 2 of the 3 for the Belmont Report are respect for persons and beneficence. Under respect for persons, the first is that all participants who are in any of these studies, be it psychology or biomedical, are to be treated as autonomous agents. And what we mean by this is that they should be free to make up their own minds in regard to participating in that research, for how long they would like to participate, should they, or whether they would like to remove themselves at any time. They should also be able to do this in a manner that is free of coercion. Now, oftentimes when we think about coercion, we think of someone sort of putting that proverbial boot onto the back of our neck or holding a gun to our head or something like that. But in this context, while of course those fit in this class also, incentives that are too good to decline are also a form of coercion. For example, if I was to have you take part in some either compromising or extremely painful study, and in order to get you to do it, I was like, okay, you don't have to take part in it, but if you do take part in it, I will give you $10 million, and then I will give every single one of your family members each $10 million. It would become very difficult to decline in those cases, even if something very bad was to happen. As just a thought exercise, I realize it's somewhat morbid, but how much money or care would each of your family members need to receive in order for you to give up your freedom for the rest of your life? Maybe you'll say there's no amount of money or care that can be given to all of your family members in order to do so, but just think about it. The second part under respect for persons is that not all people have equal autonomy, and thus those who have any form of compromised autonomy should be protected. People who fall under this class are children, for example, because they might not understand the full ramification or context of the study they find themselves in. Same is true for those who suffer from mental deficits as well. Another example that people oftentimes don't think about here are prisoners, because they oftentimes are not children and do not necessarily have mental deficits of any kind. They're just ultimately regular people who were largely just in bad situations and are thus paying the consequences. But being a prisoner oftentimes means that they're at a very large power differential and in the non-favorable side of that. So even requests that are posed to them might always seem like requests, and someone who's afraid of repercussions, even if those repercussions might not come, technically is now already moved across what we would consider this line of coercion. So not only are all members to be treated autonomously, but special care should be given to those who cannot truly act on that autonomy for themselves. The second part of the Belmont Report is beneficence, and beneficence ultimately just states that researchers have a responsibility to protect their participants from harm and to maintain their well-being to the extent that is possible. Now, this type of harm applies to all forms of harm, not just physical harm. It could be psychological distress, it could be emotional distress, it could even be something like making sure that any kind of personal information that is recorded over the course of research is stored on either encrypted hard drives, or it is anonymized, or it is spread across to make it difficult to ever identify the individuals themselves. Because if that information is personal or sensitive and it is compromised, it could lead to difficult situations for those individuals. We all have things that we don't want our elders or our bosses to know, for example. But sometimes research does ask about these types of things. Now, it is important to mention here that there are some times or cases where certain types of research will do some degree of harm to participants. In those cases, oftentimes panels will be convened and assembled to debate the costs and merits. And oftentimes the way in which this works is that the costs of harm are weighed against the potential benefits that could be conferred by the remainder of the population. For example, recently in the development of the vaccines, there was a set of studies, or a study that was conducted to advance the development of a vaccine, whereby they wanted to infect actual individuals with the COVID virus to then see its progression and to test the efficacy of these vaccines, instead of just giving people the vaccines and seeing if perhaps they would get infected at large. Now, all of these individuals were between 18 and 35, I believe, and ultimately the discussion happened of you are committing harm to several thousand individuals who you would potentially infect with this virus after giving them a test vaccine, but it could have increased or sped up the development of that particular vaccine by as much as 6 months to a year. And all the potential individuals who could have been saved by that modern vaccine, does that weigh out the few people who might have died, even though most were managed in the hospital after infecting them with COVID? Now, while you might easily land one way or another based on whatever your intuition and moral principles are, oftentimes these questions can be difficult to answer, especially when the lives of millions, if not billions of people are at stake. Finally, the third part of the Belmont Report is justice. And this principle states that whenever research is conducted, the people on whom it is conducted should be representative of the people who will benefit from that research. What this means is that if the research is slated to benefit all of humanity, then those who it is conducted on should represent a subset, a representative subset of that entire group. If the only individuals who are going to benefit from a certain type of research, let's say, are only individuals who are over the age of 70 years old and identify as female. Now, in those cases, it would be okay to do the research on people who are over 75 and identify as female, because they're the only ones who are ultimately going to benefit from said research. But if research will be broadly applicable, it is not appropriate to only use some subset of individuals on whom to test, specifically a disadvantaged group. This was mentioned when we were talking about the Tuskegee syphilis study. Now, just to leave you with a question to think about, is it then an ethical violation that the large majority of all psychological studies that are conducted in this country are conducted on psychology students, while the actual implications and benefits of that research are much more widely applied? And is it an ethical violation that psychology students, specifically undergraduate students, are unduly bearing a burden of this research?